The canvas walls of the medical tent shivered under the wind, carrying the damp smell of rain and disinfectant. On a rough wooden bench sat a young Japanese nurse, no older than 20, her uniform torn, her sleeve bloodied. Across from her, an American medic leaned in silence, his hands steady as he wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. She braced for cruelty, for the humiliation she had been taught would surely come. Instead, she felt the surprising gentleness of a stranger's care. For years, her commanders and teachers had promised her capture meant shame worse than death. She had whispered oaths to never fall into enemy hands, convinced that surrender was the end of dignity. And yet, in this place where she expected torment, she found stew steaming in bowls, bread soft against her lips in blankets, folded neatly for women who had gone days without warmth. The contradiction struck her like a blow. What does it mean when the enemy feeds you better than your own army? How does one reconcile the taste of meat and coffee with a lifetime of warnings about monsters in human form? Was everything she believed about honor, duty, and sacrifice built on lies? The young nurse clutched the bandage around her arm, her mind racing with questions. She dared not speak aloud. Around her, the myths of Bushido began to crumble, replaced by something far more dangerous than fear, curiosity. And this was only the beginning of a journey that would unravel not just her own beliefs but the story her entire nation had been told. Would kindness, offered in the heart of captivity, prove more powerful than any weapon? The answer waited beyond the barbed wire. The bandage around her arm was still warm from the medic's hands when a steaming bowl of stew was placed in front of her. The smell rose immediately, rich with meat and vegetables she had almost forgotten existed, and her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Hunger surged, her hands trembled, yet she hesitated because nothing in her training had prepared her for this. She had been told to expect blows, not bread. She had been told to brace for violation, not nourishment. The shock of the bandage had unsettled her, but this bowl of food was unbearable in its kindness. For years she had absorbed the same lesson, drilled into every soldier and auxiliary to be captured was to forfeit honor. Bushido, the warrior's code, whispered through the barracks like scripture teaching that shame lay not in death, but in survival under an enemy's gaze. The young men were told to fall on their swords, to clutch grenades to their chests rather than be taken alive. The women had their own oaths, softer in tone, but just as binding: better to die by your own hand than endure the dishonor of captivity. Surrender was not survival, it was betrayal. Families would rather receive a folded flag than a daughter who had allowed herself to be fed by the enemy. And so she sat with the stew before her, the steam curling into her face, her stomach twisting with need, and she felt torn in two. Her body screamed for the food, but her training screamed louder, that to taste it was to betray not just herself, but her ancestors. How could something as simple as soup carry so much weight? The reality of the camp mocked every expectation she carried with her across the battlefield. She had seen men abandoned on roadsides, bleeding out because they were too weak to march another step. She had watched officers strike their subordinates across the face for faltering under exhaustion. She had eaten bowls of thin rice, stretched with bark, and dust gnawed on weeds, pretending they were vegetables. That, she was told, was honor. To suffer was to prove loyalty. To endure pain was to become part of something greater than oneself. But here, under canvas walls that smelled of disinfectant, she was offered a different vision of survival. American guards walked among the prisoners, not with sneers or rifles raised, but with trays of bread and mugs of coffee. A medic frowned in concentration, not in cruelty, as he cleaned her wound. Another soldier offered a cigarette, his hand steady, his eyes void of triumph. Each gesture chipped away at the wall of fear she had carried into this place. What unsettled her most was not just the kindness itself, but the ordinariness of it. These men did not act as though they were performing miracles. They acted as though feeding the hungry, binding wounds, and offering rest were simply what one did for other human beings. The contrast was staggering. She had grown up under the shadow of propaganda that painted Americans as demons, ruthless and depraved. Her commanders repeated endlessly that capture meant torture so vile death would seem merciful. And yet here she was with a bandage tighter and cleaner than any her own officers had given her, and a meal so rich she could barely believe it was real. The other women reacted much the same. Some clutched their food with suspicion, convinced that kindness was a trap. Others wept openly as they tasted meat for the first time in months, their tears falling into their bowls. One woman hid her bread in her sleeve, certain she would be beaten if she ate too quickly, certain that punishment was inevitable. But no punishment came. The guards simply watched with mild curiosity, as though this scene were nothing unusual. The absence of cruelty was itself a cruelty of another kind. It forced them to question everything. Her thoughts tangled around the central paradox. If surrender was dishonor, then why did this food taste like salvation? If the enemy was inhuman, then why did their laughter sound so normal, even warm? If life under captivity could be so strangely gentle, then what did that mean about the captivity world she had believed in until now? Each moment became a test of belief. When a guard offered her water, she flinched, expecting the crack of a rifle butt. Instead, the canteen pressed cool into her palm. When the medic touched her arm, she braced for pain, but he only tightened the bandage and nodded as though satisfied with his work. When another soldier gestured toward the stew, encouraging her to eat, she hesitated until the hunger finally overwhelmed her shame. The first spoonful nearly undid her. The broth slid down her throat, thick with flavor, and her body shook with relief, so sharp it felt like pain. She lowered the spoon tears burning behind her eyes and wondered if she had betrayed something sacred simply by surviving. But as she sat there surrounded by women who were also tasting disbelief, a seed of doubt took root. If her commanders had lied about this, if they had lied about the nature of captivity, what else had they lied about? Was honor really found in starvation? Was loyalty truly measured by how much suffering one could endure? Or had the empire simply found in death and pain the most efficient tools of control? The stew cooled in her bowl as her thoughts spiraled, each one more dangerous than the last. To accept kindness from the enemy was to admit that they were not monsters. To admit they were not monsters was to question the empire's story of the war itself. And to question the empire was to stand on the edge of treason. Yet, even as these thoughts churned, the warmth of the bandage on her arm and the taste of broth in her mouth whispered a truth. Harder to silence than any oath survival did not feel like shame. It felt like life. Around her, the women exchanged glances, their eyes wide with the same unspoken realization. The barbed wire outside the tent still marked them as prisoners, but inside something more profound was happening. The myths of Bushido were unraveling thread by thread, undone not by bombs or bullets, but by blankets and bread. It was a battlefield of belief, and the first victory did not belong to empire or enemy. It belonged to the quiet, unbearable truth that the world was not what they had been told. The young nurse lowered her gaze to her hands, still trembling around the spoon. She did not understand this new reality, but she could no longer deny it. The contradiction was too sharp, too undeniable. She had entered the camp certain that captivity was worse than death. Now, with food in her belly and a clean bandage on her arm, she faced a question that would haunt her long after the war ended. If kindness could be found behind barbed wire, what else in her world had been a lie? The days began to fall into a rhythm that felt at once alien and strangely soothing. The first morning, the women awoke not to barked orders or the slap of boots, but to the faint aroma of bacon drifting through the slats of the wooden barrack. At first, they lay still, paralyzed with disbelief, thinking it's some cruel trick of the senses. Yet the smell grew stronger, undeniable, and soon a guard's steady voice, not angry, not sharp, just firm, called them to breakfast. They shuffled into line as though walking into a trap, their eyes lowered, their steps hesitant, waiting for the illusion to collapse. Instead, they were handed trays heavy with eggs, bread, and steaming mugs of coffee. The nurse stared at her portion, her stomach a tight knot of longing and suspicion. She had known hunger so sharp it gnawed her bones, had stretched a single bowl of watery rice over 3 days, had felt the dizzy haze of near starvation. Now the richness of yolk burst across her tongue, the bread warm and soft against her teeth, and the shock was almost violent. Some women wept silently as they ate, overwhelmed by flavors they thought lost to memory. One woman laughed suddenly, the sound wild and almost hysterical, then covered her mouth in shame. But no punishment followed, no harsh blow to silence her. The guards only glanced over, curiosity in their eyes, as though even laughter were permitted here. The beds themselves became revelations. Wooden frames, thin mattresses, real blankets, things that seemed too luxurious to be trusted. The nurse sat on the edge of hers, gripping the blanket, as if it might be snatched away. For the first time since leaving home, she had an object that was hers alone, something meant to shield her from the cold, rather than test her endurance. That blanket became a symbol of worth. It whispered that her life, fragile and ordinary as it was, mattered enough to be kept warm. Healthcare in the camp was another shock. One woman, plagued for years by a rotting tooth, was led to a dentist's chair. The light was harsh, the instruments foreign, and she trembled as though facing execution. Yet moments later the tooth was gone, the pain with it replaced not by torture but by relief so profound she wept openly. Another woman received a pair of spectacles fitted carefully to her eyes. When she slipped them on, the world sharpened into clarity she had not known for years. She touched the frames with reverence, as if they were relics, and the American doctor simply said, "No one should live in a blur." These acts, so ordinary to the men who offered them, were radical to the women who received them. Pain had always been the measure of devotion. Now they discovered that relief was possible, that healing could be a form of recognition. Beyond food and medicine, there were smaller astonishments that built upon one another until they felt like a world turned upside down. Paper and pencils were distributed, and the prisoners were told they could write letters home. At first they froze, convinced it was a cruel deception, that their words would never leave the camp. Yet when the young nurse held a sheet of paper in her hands, she felt its weight as though it were gold. She hesitated, then wrote carefully, "Mother, I am alive. They feed me. They treat me kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." The act of writing, of being allowed to speak in her own voice, was more radical than the food or the blankets. It gave her back her individuality, a piece of herself stripped away by war. Education, too, slipped into their days. A guard who spoke some Japanese began to teach English letters on a chalkboard, drawing them slowly, patiently. The nurse hesitated, chalk trembling in her hand, before scrawling her first shaky attempt at the word home. The guard nodded, encouraging, and she felt a spark of pride that startled her. In her world, education had always been about duty, about sharpening oneself into a tool for the empire. Here it was offered as though her own growth, her own mind mattered. That single word, written in white dust, opened a door she had never known existed. Evenings carried their own peculiar gifts. A harmonica played across the barracks, sometimes by a guard, sometimes by a prisoner who had learned from him. The notes were clumsy but tender, drifting into the night like fragments of a forgotten dream. The nurse sat with her back against the wall, eyes closed, hearing not military marches or victory songs, but music for the sake of beauty alone. Once a prisoner stumbled through a tune so badly, the others burst into laughter, guards included, and for a moment the camp seemed less like captivity and more like a strange village suspended in time. Humor became another kind of medicine. The first time peanut butter was offered, confusion reigned. One woman sniffed the brown paste, dipped her finger, tasted it, and spat it out with such ferocity that the others gasped. But then the guards laughed, not cruelly but with genuine amusement, and the women, embarrassed, began to laugh too. Another tried it cautiously, then another, until the sticky sweetness became a kind of running joke. The nurse herself, who had never imagined such a flavor, smiled despite herself. In that laughter, fragile and awkward, a crack opened in the wall of fear. The garden came later. A soldier handed the nurse a small packet of seeds and gestured toward a patch of earth. She did not understand his words, but the meaning was clear enough. Grow something. At first, she felt foolish, her fingers clumsy in the soil. But soon she found herself kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into the earth with something like reverence. To coax life from the ground instead of tending to wounds was a new form of care, one that hinted at a future she had never dared imagine. Each of these details, soup and coffee, blankets and bandages, letters and laughter, seemed trivial on their own. But together, they built a portrait of survival unlike anything the women had known. It was not just the preservation of life, but the quiet restoration of dignity. The Americans may not have intended it as such. To them, these were routine acts governed by procedure and convention. Yet to the women who received them, they were revelations. Every kindness contradicted the Empire's story. Every act of normalcy was proof that they were more than tools, more than expendable bodies. The nurse often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling beams above her bunk, listening to the faint notes of a harmonica or the murmur of guards speaking softly outside. She thought of her family in Japan, of her mother rationing rice husks, of her brothers shivering in threadbare uniforms. She thought of the stew she had eaten, the letters she had written, the seeds waiting in the soil. Slowly, the voice inside her that whispered shame began to falter. In its place grew another quieter whisper. Maybe I am worth this. The camp remained a prison. Barbed wire, sharp against the horizon, guards with rifles always nearby. Yet within its boundaries unfolded something radical, almost dangerous, a recognition of their humanity. The nurse could not have explained it fully, but she felt it in every warm blanket, every spoonful of soup, every note of music. These were not luxuries. They were affirmations. And in affirmations, dignity took root. For a woman once trained to believe her only worth was sacrifice, this was nothing short of a revolution. At night, when the camp settled into uneasy silence, and only the faint hum of guards' voices or the thin notes of a harmonica drifted across the barracks, the young nurse lay awake, with her blanket pulled to her chin. The warmth that once felt like salvation now pressed on her like a weight, as though each stitch carried an accusation. Every comfort she received, every bowl of stew, every clean bandage, every kind word forced her to confront the unbearable truth that she had accepted tenderness from the hands of her enemy. In her mind, Bushido rose like a ghost, whispering of honor and shame of oaths, sworn in training halls of ancestors who would rather die than see her alive in captivity. She remembered the words spoken so often, they became part of her heartbeat, better to die than to surrender. Yet here she was alive, breathing, and fed. The contradiction gnawed at her soul. Shame became her first companion. She avoided the eyes of the other women, afraid they saw in her the same weakness she feared in herself. When she drank coffee or ate bread, she did so quickly as though hiding the evidence of betrayal. She whispered to herself that it was only survival that the Empire would understand, but the lie tasted bitter. More bitter still was the realization that each kindness touched something deep inside her, something she could not silence. Relief, gratitude, even a flicker of trust. It felt like treason simply to feel it. Yet the questions would not leave her. If the Americans were demons, why did they treat wounds with care? If surrender was dishonor, why did life under captivity feel less cruel than life under her own officers? She remembered the slaps, the shouting, the starvation rations stretched. With bark and dust, the way the Empire measured loyalty through suffering. Then she remembered the American medic frowning over her arm, not with disdain, but with focus. And she wondered which of them truly valued her life. These questions grew sharper with every passing day. She watched another woman receive medicine for fever instead of punishment for weakness. She saw guards laugh gently when prisoners stumbled over English words, correcting them patiently instead of striking them. She heard music played not to command obedience, but simply because beauty was permitted here. Each moment clashed violently with the world she had known. Slowly the myth cracked. Perhaps the enemy was not the barbarian. Perhaps the barbarian was the system that demanded her death. The shift terrified her. She had been raised to believe that identity was forged in obedience, that dignity was proven through sacrifice. But in the camp she discovered a different measure of worth. A blanket meant she mattered. A pair of spectacles meant her vision was worth restoring. A meal meant her hunger deserved relief. None of it was grand. None of it was glorious. Yet these simple gestures unraveled everything. She no longer knew what honor meant, only that it could not be built from pain alone. One evening she overheard a woman whispering in the barrack. Her voice choked with despair. "I cannot face my family," the woman said. "They will see me as dishonored. Perhaps it is better if I end it here." The nurse's chest clenched. She remembered her own thoughts, her own shame. But then another prisoner reached across the darkness, gripped the woman's hands, and whispered, "If the enemy values our lives, why do we not?" The words struck like a bolt of lightning. In the silence that followed, the nurse felt her own beliefs shake on their foundations. If even enemies could see worth in her existence, why was she so eager to erase it? The turning point came not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet moment of laughter. The peanut butter incident had spread amusement through the camp, and one evening the nurse found herself chuckling with the others at the memory of sticky faces and bitter grimaces. The sound startled her. She had not laughed in years. The shame that followed was sharp but weaker than before, and for the first time, she let herself wonder if joy was not a betrayal, but a right. Slowly, her thoughts shifted from survival to existence. She began to sit straighter, to meet the guard's eyes with caution rather than fear, to speak her name when asked instead of whispering it. She helped in the kitchen, her hands steady as she learned to bake bread, and for the first time felt a small pride that had nothing to do with empire or sacrifice. The old oath still haunted her: better to die than to surrender. But now another voice whispered beneath it, quiet but insistent, "Maybe I am worth this life." The internal war raged daily. At times she still recoiled, convinced she was betraying her ancestors. But each night, as she wrapped herself in her blanket, each morning as she lifted a spoon of stew to her lips, the shame weakened and something stronger took its place. It was not loyalty to America, nor rejection of Japan. It was the radical idea that her life belonged to her, not to generals or emperors, not to codes written centuries ago. That realization was more dangerous than any weapon. Once tasted, it could not be forgotten. Dignity, she learned, was not earned by dying well. It was found in living, in being seen, and knowing that one's pain and hunger mattered. The empire had promised glory and delivered suffering. The enemy had promised nothing and delivered kindness. And in that paradox, she discovered a truth more subversive than treason. Perhaps her worth had never been measured by surrender or death, but by the undeniable fact that she was human. As the weeks passed, she stopped whispering oaths in the dark and began to whisper questions instead. What was honor if it demanded starvation? What was loyalty if it required silence? And what did it mean when survival itself felt like the first true act of defiance? Each question pulled her further from the world she had known and closer to a new one she could not yet name. The camp remained enclosed in barbed wire, yet within those fences she felt something expand. The shame that once consumed her began to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious, trembling belief. She had entered the camp convinced she would rather die than live as a prisoner. Now she lay awake on her bunk, staring at the beams overhead, and thought, maybe I am not dishonored. Maybe I am alive. And maybe against everything I was taught, that is enough. When the war ended, it did not arrive for her with fanfare or celebration, but with a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air. Word spread through the camp. Slowly whispers carried from guard to prisoner, until at last the announcement came. In plain terms, Japan had surrendered. The women sat stunned, staring at the ground, as though waiting for the words to turn back into smoke. For years they had been told that capture was a fate worse than death, that to live as prisoners was to betray the empire. And now the empire itself had bent its head. The paradox was unbearable. The barbed wire still framed their world, but its meaning shifted overnight. It no longer marked them as captives of war, but as survivors who had witnessed the collapse of everything they had been told to believe. Repatriation began in fragments. Trucks carried them to ports. Ships ferried them back across gray seas, and slowly the women found themselves returning to a homeland they had not seen in years. The young nurse clutched a small bundle of belongings given to her by the Americans, a blanket, a pair of spectacles, and the letter she had once written to her mother. They seemed trivial objects, yet in her heart they held the weight of an entire world. She pressed them close as the coastline of Japan rose on the horizon, wondering what awaited her. Would she be welcomed as a daughter returned, or shunned as one who had disgraced her family by surrendering. Would the kindness she had tasted vanish the moment her feet touched Japanese soil? The land she returned to was not the same land she had left. Cities lay in ruins, bombed into skeletons of stone and steel. Families scraped together weeds for soup. Children's eyes hollow with hunger, mothers bending under the weight of silence. Her own home was gone, burned to ash. She found her mother thinner than she could bear, to see her hands shaking as they stirred bitter broth. When she spoke of her time in the camp, she did so cautiously, almost in whispers. She described the meals, the blankets, the letters, the way American doctors had fitted her with spectacles so she could see the world clearly for the first time in years. At first, her mother wept, not from shame, but from relief, murmuring, "At least someone remembered you were human." The words lodged in the nurse's heart like a thorn. How was it that the empire promised glory, yet delivered starvation, while the enemy sworn to be cruel had given her dignity? Not everyone could accept such contradictions. Some families viewed returning prisoners with suspicion, as if survival itself were a betrayal. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. A few women unable to bear the weight of dishonor chose silence for the rest of their lives, burying their memories as though silence could erase them. Yet others cautiously began to speak. They told stories of guards who learned their names of laughter over peanut butter, of letters that crossed oceans even when censored. They spoke of music drifting across barracks, of seeds pressed into soil, of the miracle of chocolate shared by an enemy. Each story unsettled those who heard it because it contradicted the entire structure of propaganda on which the war had been built. The nurse carried her own memories like hidden treasures. At night she unfolded the blanket worn thin by travel and felt the same warmth she had felt in captivity. She cleaned her spectacles carefully, remembering the American doctor who told her, "No one should live in a blur." She kept the scrap of paper where she had written her first hesitant English word. These objects were not luxuries. They were symbols, relics of a strange paradise that had existed behind barbed wire. They reminded her daily that honor could not be built from suffering alone, that dignity could be given freely even by those once called enemies. Over time, these personal truths began to ripple outward. Women like her, once silenced by shame, became quiet seeds of change in post-war Japan. Some raised their children with a different lesson, teaching them that compassion could be stronger than cruelty. Others worked in communities to rebuild homes and schools, carrying with them the conviction that human worth was not measured in sacrifice, but in survival. Their testimonies, scattered but insistent, challenged the nation's old myths. They planted doubts in minds once hardened by obedience, whispering that peace might grow not from conquest, but from recognition of shared humanity. Historians would later note that the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners had strategic value, yielding cooperation, intelligence, even propaganda victories. But for the nurse and women like her, the true legacy was not political, but deeply personal. They had glimpsed a world where dignity bloomed in the least likely place, where kindness survived even in the midst of destruction. And that glimpse could not be erased. It colored the way they moved through their shattered homeland, the way they raised children, the way they spoke when they dared of the war. The paradox lingered everywhere. Japan's streets were filled with hunger and rubble, yet she remembered the taste of hot stew in captivity. Families clung to silence, yet she recalled laughter echoing in barracks at the taste of peanut butter. The empire had demanded death as proof of loyalty, yet the enemy had taught her that life itself carried worth. Each memory was a challenge to the world around her, a reminder that even in the darkest war, humanity had survived. Years later, when she was older, she would speak of these things to a historian who asked what captivity had been like. She smiled faintly, shook her head, and said, "They gave me chocolate, and I did not believe it was real. I thought it must be a trick, but then I saw the guard eat the same piece. That moment changed me." Her words joined countless others, forming a mosaic of testimonies that refused to let propaganda have the final say. The young nurse who once believed her only worth lay in sacrifice now carried a different truth. She had been valued by strangers, treated as if her hunger, her pain, her vision mattered. That knowledge had become indelible, a quiet revolution etched into her life. It followed her through ruined streets, through nights of rebuilding, through decades of memory. And though the empire had fallen, though cities had been rebuilt, the contradiction remained. Paradise had once existed inside a prison, not of luxury, but of humanity. That paradox became her legacy, and the legacy of thousands like her. They did not topple governments with their testimonies, but they changed families, neighborhoods, generations. They showed that dignity could bloom even behind barbed wire, that kindness could fracture even the hardest ideology. And in that truth, whispered across years and oceans, lay the greatest shock of all, that in a world devoted to destruction, it was compassion, not conquest, that endured. The war had long ended, but its echoes lived on in the lives of those who had carried its weight. For the young nurse, Captivity was never simply a memory of fences, guards, and numbered barracks. It was the paradox she carried like a hidden scar, the discovery that the very place she had been taught to fear most became the first place where she was treated as a human being. That knowledge did not vanish with repatriation, nor did it fade with the passing years. It stayed with her in the warmth of a blanket she refused to throw away, in the spectacles that allowed her to see her mother's face clearly after so many years of blur, and the faint taste of chocolate she never quite forgot. These objects, so small and ordinary, became monuments to a truth larger than war itself. For her generation, the struggle did not end with the surrender of the empire. It continued in the silence of dinner tables, where families avoided speaking of shame, in the whispered suspicions of neighbors, in the crushing weight of being labeled dishonored. Yet some, like her, chose not to bury the memory, but to carry it carefully into the fragile dawn of post-war Japan. They raised their children with a different story, one that taught that kindness could be stronger than cruelty, that dignity was not bought by suffering, but preserved in small acts of care. These lessons, passed quietly from parent to child, became seeds of change in a society struggling to rebuild itself from ash. Historians would later point to treaties, strategies, and political maneuvers as the forces that reshaped the post-war world. But beneath the headlines and speeches, there were smaller revolutions happening in kitchens, classrooms, and crowded tenements. Revolutions born of women who had once been prisoners, but who now understood the radical power of compassion. Their stories whispered of a different kind of survival, one not rooted in conquest or obedience, but in the simple recognition of humanity, even across enemy lines. The nurse, now older, often thought of the moment when she first tasted stew in the camp, when the warmth of broth slid down her throat and tears blurred her vision. That moment had unraveled an entire belief system. It had forced her to ask, if the enemy could show mercy, what else in the world was untrue? That question remained with her, always shaping the way she looked at her country, her children, her neighbors. It reminded her that honor was not found in death, but in life preserved with dignity. In the end, her story was not one of defeat or betrayal, but of transformation. She had entered the camp certain that her worth was tied to obedience and sacrifice. She left it carrying a new truth, that she mattered simply because she was human. And once that truth took root, it could never be silenced. It lived in every letter she wrote, every story she told, every silent act of kindness she passed on. It was a quiet revolution, invisible to armies and governments, yet powerful enough to outlast them all. The legacy of those women, hidden in memories and whispered testimonies, asks us still, what does it mean to honor life? If paradise could exist inside a prison, if dignity could be found behind barbed wire, then perhaps the true battlefield is not between nations, but within ourselves. And in that battlefield, compassion may always prove the strongest weapon of all.